Okay, everybody, so today we're doing something a little bit different. Instead of a book, we are looking at a Miyazaki film, Princess Mononoke. There's a lot that went into this film directly, and a lot that I can extract from it and apply to the world around us. So I'll start with just a general outline of the plot. It starts with a small town in Japan getting attacked by a wild boar, but not just any wild boar, a demon monster. The boar is possessed by this writhing mass of incarnated hate is really what it is. The prince of the town kills the boar, but in doing so, he is touched by that incarnation of hate. It grabs his arm at one point, and it leaves a mark on it. That mark becomes a scar, and it starts gradually spreading throughout his body. He has a meeting with the town elders, and they tell him that the wound will consume him, flesh and bone, kill him slowly, and cause him much pain. He is to go on a quest to find the origin of this hate, and he must see with heart unclouded by hate, and see if he can lift the curse. Or not necessarily lift the curse, he's told that there is no changing his own fate, but see if he can do anything about the situation that he finds. He leaves the town and he travels further and further until he finds a forest that is in a state of conflict with a group of humans who have built what they call Iron Town. Their leader, Lady Eboshi, leads them in manufacturing guns to defend the town, gunpowder weapons. And this town has conflicts with other groups of humans, of course, but also conflicts with nature, conflicts with the various gods of the forest, who are fighting to reclaim the land that has been deforested for the sake of industrialization. And throughout the story, the prince is able to live among and get to know both the forest and the Iron Town people. The story very much humanizes both sides, despite the conflict against each other. The story starts coming to a head when a monk named Jigo, with a group of hunters, start going after the forest god, the spirit of the forest, the god of life and death in that forest. And their desire is to decapitate this forest god and steal his head. And at first when they say that, I thought that was just a metaphorical sense they wanted to kill the god, but they literally wanted to put his head in a jar and go away with it. So the story climaxes with this intense battle between Iron Town, Jigo's men, and the creatures of the forest. And throughout the whole thing, the prince tries to act as a mediator and defender of all sides, trying to stop the fighting. The forest god is eventually killed, or rather beheaded, not killed, and his spirit starts going crazy, killing everything it touches, growing into an amorphous blob that consumes everything for miles around, until the prince is able to confront Jigo, take the head back, and offer the head back to the forest god. Now, there's a lot that can be said here about the idea of hate itself. One would say that this entire story is about hate, and in that way, more than anything else, this story reminded me of Naruto, actually. The prince is carrying a curse of hatred in this movie, and despite that, he is the most loving, the most compassionate, the most merciful, the most interceding, and the most peacemaking character. And I saw that as being similar to Naruto dealing with a wider manifestation of hate than is depicted in this movie. The hate in Naruto is depicted as an entire cycle that repeats itself, a cycle of revenge and death. And one side loses a brother, they go out and kill the other side's cousin, they go out and kill the other side's cousin. Just an endless cycle of revenge killings between clans. That's what Naruto depicts it as. And I don't think Miyazaki was necessarily far off from taking his story to an extent such as that. Now the prince, by comparison, he's given this curse from that boar god, the hateful demon. And I say boar god, it used to be one of the gods of the forest, but it was taken over by a demon of hate. It is no longer a thinking thing at the point in the movie at the very beginning when the prince has that fight with it. And the hate seeks to spread itself, and it implants itself inside the prince, inside this absolute merciful character. And I just couldn't help but think of Kurama being trapped inside Naruto, this both loving and dorky little kid who seeks to cure the world, but he has a thousands-year-old demon trapped inside him that's just spiteful from a past of being used by so many humans. And I find it interesting as well that there are some points in the movie where the prince doesn't seem to want to participate in combat. He seems sort of compelled to do it by the curse on his arm. There's a scene before he even gets to Iron Town, he encounters a group of samurai that attack him, and he repeatedly warns them, I'm warning you, I don't want to kill you. But despite that, we see that the hate in his arm gives supernatural powers to his bow and arrow that he uses. He decapitates a guy like that, he shoots a guy's arms off like that. That would be the only scene I would say where I see him losing control of himself as a result of that curse. So I question whether or not he actually did want to kill the samurai. I mean, certainly he didn't want to kill them, but want to enter combat to defend himself rather than just running away. And then a little more waxing poetic about the concept of hate itself. One of the interesting points about this story is how none of the characters are completely universally bad. There is no bad guy in the story. The characters don't act out of good or evil as you might see in a Disney princess movie. The characters are just motivated by their circumstances, their positions, motivated by a desire to protect what they love. And that, again, I can't help but compare it to Naruto and the cycle of revenge. But I'll also draw a comparison to the Eastern concept of yin and yang, which one of the ways that can be interpreted is there is a little bit of good inside every evil person and a little bit of evil inside every good person. The nighttime has stars and the daytime has shadows. Reality is a duality of contrasting forces, but each of those two forces each have a piece of the other inside them, and they are each complementary to each other. That's the idea of yin and yang. Or if we want to describe the lack of a purely evil character through the lens of something that comes a little further from the West, I'll give a quote from Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn: "The line between good and evil passes through every human heart." That quote deals more with morality in general, but certainly can be expanded to deal with a story of love and hate and war like this one is. Now that said, I do want to cover the religious aspects of this story, because as with any anime, you're going to find heavy traces of Shintoism, or even sometimes Hinduism, or even sometimes Chinese folk religion mixed in there. Japanese Shintoism very much is a superstitious faith. They believe in ghosts and spirits. I'll call it one of the last few animistic religions in the world. It is one of the few pre-axial age religions that still exists, still has followers, and by axial age I mean the few thousand years in human history where most of the great faiths that we know today were spawned. It begins with Zoroaster, of the Zoroastrian faith in Persia, continues with Buddha, and then Jesus in the middle, Confucius shortly before Jesus, and then it wraps up around the time of Muhammad. These figures that I named did so much to shape human history, and even the entire mindset of humanity going forward for the rest of time. And historians, when they look at this, they name the axial age as that span of time, when so much revolution in spiritual thought occurred, mostly led by these figures. And Japan is unique in that Shintoism still has that polytheistic, animistic element to it that hasn't been touched by the axial age. So they believe in ghosts, they take them for granted, in fact. They believe the trees have spirits, they take that for granted, in fact. So as the characters explore this natural world, they do see little tree spirits with wiggling heads around. They do see that animals have this natural language of communicating with each other that humans have lost, except for Princess Mononoke, who is that wolf girl, the girl who was given up as an orphan as a baby and was raised among wolves. We do see that the natural world has this spiritual life, spiritual energy to it, that many people in the West just don't fully invite into their way of thinking. We've become very scientific-minded, but that's not even the whole of it. These axial age religions have, in a way, shaped and defined limits and rules for how this spiritual stuff works. They make concrete statements about how God works, how the afterlife works. And in part, as an outsider looking into Shintoism, maybe us axial age thinkers have lost something of the natural wonder for the world. And you know me, I can't help but compare Christianity to this. To contrast the ideas about how nature works and mankind's role as a part of nature, or as not a part of nature perhaps, I'll bring in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. This is immediately after creating humanity. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." 29. Then God said, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food." 30. And all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. And not only do we see in the story of Genesis God giving all of nature, all of creation to humanity, giving us the permission and ability, and one might even call that a command, to subdue it. But there's a part of the Genesis story where God literally presents the creatures one by one to Adam and has him name them. Now, on its surface, looking at this alone, it may seem like Christian theology has an antagonistic view towards nature, viewing humans as the superior species who are destined to bend nature to our will. If we look at that alone, one might think that humans are commanded to industrialize, rip up forests, start factory farms. But that's missing the also very present element of stewardship, which is a word you'll hear a lot if you're in Christian circles where they talk about finance. The idea that we are not the owners of this wealth. We are the stewards of it. God has given it to us to look after, but it belongs to God at the end of the day. And it's very much the same concept with the natural world. We are given this earth. It is not ours, but we are tasked with looking after it. And just as if someone asked us to house sit, we wouldn't wreck the entire house and throw a party. We have this duty to keep it looking nice, keep it looking the way God intended it. So there's this contrast between Eastern and Western thinking, or perhaps a contrast between axial and pre-axial thinking, where Christians view the world as something that is inanimate, but at the same time humans have this duty to look after it. Whereas a Shintoist would have an element of wonder and fear and awe, and they would see, or at least perceive, these spirits and lesser gods who rule over all the aspects of the forest. So that's a very interesting thing to look at least I think. I also have a couple little notes on this subject I wanted to touch on that don't really fit in well with that bigger topic I just went over. The first one is when the prince first leaves his village, one of the things he does is he cuts off his hair and he leaves the hair sitting on an altar. I think that very brief action has more significance than a Western mind would attribute to it. I don't know exactly the nature of that significance, but what I know of the East, there would be an element of shame, an element of giving up your position, an element of being demoted from the title or the status that you worked for, and once again becoming someone who doesn't yet have a place in the world. So it could be that, again, I don't exactly know. Something else I could be, I recall reading Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which is a Chinese classic novel, and the attitude in there towards cutting the hair is, it's something people never willingly did at that time and place, because it was seen as giving up a part of your body that your parents gave you. Something else I thought was interesting was the symbology of technology and those gunpowder weapons I mentioned that the Iron Town uses. When I saw that, I couldn't help but think of the way that the book Anna Karenina by Lev Tolstoy employs the symbology of trains to represent human progress, industrial progress, but the kind of progress that's not always spiritually good. Trains in that book represent a new beginning, the ability to travel anywhere, to lose your identity, but also represents something that's very dangerous. And I think a very similar thing was used when the writer of this thought about putting gunpowder weapons into the story. In a setting where most of the other characters, most of the other groups, when they did combat, they were using swords, bows and arrows. We have this one town using gunpowder weapons, and it's the same town that finds itself in this deadly conflict with nature itself. Something else I noticed was that there's a particular pond in the forest, and the water in this pond is depicted to have the ability to heal almost any injury, almost any ailment. And I just want to analyze what that says about nature. I'll compare that to a non-fiction book that I'm working on recording right now, actually. It will probably be the next book review on my channel. And that book presents this idea that the human soul needs a number of things, but among them, nature, interaction with the natural world in order to be full, in order to grant the human a sense of spiritual fulfillment. The detail was not missed on me that the iron inside that board that attacked the town at the beginning, the iron thing that is said to have caused the demon of hate to spring up within him, was a projectile from one of those gunpowder weapons. And I find it interesting and poetic how that cycle of hate feeds itself. Also, one line closer to the end really caught me. It was when the prince was attempting to reclaim the head of the forest god so that he could return it to the forest god. He said specifically human hands must return it. And that part stood out to me. It makes sense because they don't want the forest to hold a grudge. They want humans to very visibly be the ones to set things right with the forest. But at the time when I first heard that, it set me on a train of thought wondering if that prince had some knowledge of the spiritual world that the other characters didn't. Now I want to take a closer look at the mentality of some of these characters. First off, we have Jigo. He's a monk and he's the guy that's hunting the head of the forest spirit. I find him interesting because he's the closest thing to an absolute villain that this movie has at all. But at the same time, I think it is a human thing to ignore the spiritual world in the way that he did, and only focus on his own material gain, which is sort of funny when you think about it, because the character is presented as being a monk. During his first real conversation with the prince, when he was sitting around the campfire with him, he had some interesting quotes, and I wrote these down because they stood out to me, not even knowing that this character would have such a significance in the story going forward. Quote, "So you say you're under a curse. So what? so is the whole damn world, unquote. And another quote, we're surrounded by angry ghosts and nobody seems to care, unquote. So he presents to the prince this world where there are so many angry spirits who hold a grudge against the living. Which, on the surface, if you look at Irontown and the way they deal with it, that would seem to be true, but I think if you look at Jigo's character going forward, I think that quote says more about him and his own attitude towards angry ghosts than it does about anyone else's. Jigo goes on to lead his group of hunters and make a deal with Irontown where they go out together and try to literally kill this forest spirit, and they very much have a shaky alliance. I'll give a quote from closer to the end of that battle they have between humans and nature. He's saying to one of his closer advisors, quote, when you're going to kill a god, let someone else do the dirty work, unquote. And Jigo says that about Lady Eboshi, the leader of Irontown, and it illustrates the shaky alliance that they have. And indeed, during that battle, there's a point where the animals are charging at the front line where the men of Irontown are standing, and then the hunters who are standing further back, they activate explosives on the front line that kills both a lot of the men and a lot of the animals. So for me, it's really, really hard to pinpoint a redeeming quality or a human element to Jigo's character, other than the fact that his temptations are so human. And I wanted to analyze the character of Lady Eboshi as well. She is given a lot more human qualities than Jigo is. We see her employing lepers and cripples. We see her forging a town and finding places for the downtrodden within that town. But then at the same time, we also see her being very antagonistic towards nature. There's a scene where she's standing on the walls of the city at night, and she's showing the prince, hey, look out there, there's forest spirits trying to replant the trees in the place where we need to work. And she literally points a gun and tries to shoot at these. We later find out they are monkey spirits that are in the process of trying to plant trees that, like they do every night, and every night they shoot and scare them away. I also see an element of hubris in trying to kill nature itself, or rather the spirit of nature itself. And since I'm bad at doing transitions, I think I'll go straight into it from here, talking about something I think we can draw from this. And that is the attitude that both the political right and the political left in the Western world today view their relationship with nature. Start with the political left. This one is a little more plain to see. They see themselves as defending a world that humans themselves are killing. We can point out all the attempts to limit our carbon emissions, all the regulations on farms and factories, the push for more solar, the push for more wind, the push for electric vehicles. And I see in that an attitude that is not dissimilar from the Shintoist attitude towards nature, where they view nature as an angry force that can easily wipe out humanity if we push too far, if we upset the balance too much. So they try to appease it with these measures, and they start thinking about humans themselves as being the destructive creatures, the disgusting creatures that are destroying everything. But what's less obvious is the attitude of the political right towards nature. They do draw a lot more from Christianity, and so it's not surprising that their thinking lines up more with Christianity. They view themselves as stewards. Sustainability is really the key concept here. If you look at hunting in almost any country in the world, animal populations are strictly controlled by the government. Hunting permits are given, but only a finite number of them, bag limits, stuff like that. And the idea is to make sure that what we're doing is sustainable. Again, farming, the places where farmers clash with leftist thinking types, have to do with restricting the amount of food they're able to put out, or perhaps they're allowed to put out. The leftists want to impose limits on some of the equipment or how much of the land they're allowed to use in a given year in interest of appeasing this carbon god. And the farmers just want to grow food sustainably. They know their land, they know what it's going to do to the land if they grow too much or too little. And they know that if they reduce the food output too much, sooner or later humans aren't going to have as much to eat. And then the left would say, if we don't do these drastic measures to reduce carbon, then climate change is going to kill us all anyway. But the right is skeptical of that claim that climate change will kill us all. So this film and this way of thinking and comparing Christianity with Shintoism forced me to look at the contrast between right and left in viewing and interacting with our natural world in a different way, and I very much appreciate that.